February 1st, 2021. Public security police storm onto the property of a government-sanctioned church in China's Wenzhou city. Their mission? Toppling a cross from the roof of a church building for a second time. They'd removed the cross 7 years earlier, but church members replaced it. Bob Fu is with China Aid, a group that helps China's persecuted Christians.
That city alone, we have documented over 1,600 churches with their crosses were being burnt, destroyed, and destructed. And many pastors, were even detained, imprisoned.
China's Christians say it's the worst persecution against them since Chairman Mao Zedong.
To use Ambassador Sam Brownback's word, it's a war against the faith. I think it's a war against the independent faith.
And it's no longer limited to certain regions of China. VOM's Todd Nettleton says this massive wave of Christian persecution is widespread, and it's coming from the national government.
What we say in 2021 is that everywhere in China, there is intense persecution of Christians. There is intense efforts to control the church, to bring the church under Communist Party control.
The crackdown is affecting every Christian in China, says Nettleton. Protestants, Catholics, government-registered churches, and unregistered house churches. And the Chinese Communist Party has a new excuse for targeting Christians.
Now, under this pretext of COVID-19 coronavirus, the Chinese Communist Party has intensified its persecution by banning all the church activities, even those services or worship or prayer meetings in believers' own homes with their own family members.
July 22nd, 2020. A loud knock on the door at the home of a woman in China's Yamen City. She tells the police outside they cannot enter her home without a permit. Moments later, they destroy the lock and enter anyway, breaking up what the government says is an illegal meeting. Fu says it's all part of President Xi Jinping's campaign of sinicization, which means Christians are only considered to be good citizens if they adhere to communist ideology.
Ironically, Xi Jinping's portrait was even put on the church pulpit along with Chairman Mao. And the first line item of worship, by the government-sanctioned church before COVID-19 was to sing the Communist Party's national anthem.
And examples go beyond churches. In Fuzhou City, a Catholic family was forced out of their government-subsidized housing after they refused to remove religious icons from their home. And China's Religious Affairs Bureau has banned religious funeral ceremonies and preaching in funeral places. Meanwhile, Christians aren't the only ones suffering. Ethnic Uyghurs from East Turkestan, a region the communist government calls Xinjiang province, are under attack.
China is home to one of the worst human rights crises of our time. It is truly the stain of the century.
One day before he left his post as U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo officially announced that China is committing genocide against the Uyghurs and Turkic people. New Secretary of State Antony Blinken supports the genocide designation. For years, the Chinese government has forced Uyghur women to undergo abortions and forced sterilizations. Twitter recently locked the account of the Chinese embassy in Washington for tweeting that Uyghur women had been emancipated from being, quote, baby-making machines. The U.S. Defense Department says as many as 3 million Uyghurs are being forcibly detained in re-education and forced labor camps. The president of East Turkestan's government in exile told me on the Global Lane that China is using the camps as a place to brainwash the Uyghurs and harvest their organs for profit. And he says detainees are being used as slave labor.
Millions are still, working in slave labor factories, producing, products for companies like Apple, Nike, Costco, and dozens of others.
And Uyghurs are reportedly being used to manufacture solar panels for export to the U.S. and elsewhere. The Chinese government calls it a poverty reduction effort. The U.S. State Department is alerting corporate CEOs and others about China's use of Uyghur slave labor so they won't become involved. Meanwhile, despite the suffering, Bob Fu is expressing optimism about the country's spiritual future. He says when the Communist Party seized government control in 1947, only about 1 million people in China claimed to be Christian. But today, after 70 years of unrelenting persecution, their numbers have grown to as many as 130 million.
So I think at the end of the day, maybe we should call President Xi Jinping as God's, faithful servant to revive his church.
Gary Lane, CBN News.